So you went to Duquesne to develop an explicitly existential phenomenological psychology program. But at the time, there was no established method for doing research from this foundation. How'd you go about creating the phenomenological method?
Well, that's too is a long story. I'll try to shorten it. When I went there, Van Kam, coming from Holland, was aware there was what was called the Utrecht School of Phenomenology. And they were doing research. So he would say, there is a method. So I asked him, what is the method? He couldn't tell me. He was a personality theorist and more of a clinician, so he was not a researcher. Although when he did his dissertation, he did a qualitative research method, but compromised a bit with the quantitative tradition. So, okay, that's fair enough for the times. So I kept asking him and he never gave me a complete answer. So I realized that I had to go to Europe. So my first sabbatical, when I had to be there 7 years, when I got the sabbatical, I went to Europe with the express purpose of discovering what the phenomenological method was. And what I did is I went to Copenhagen because there was also a Copenhagen School of Phenomenology, and I had already met some of the Utrecht School people, Linschoten and Buitendijk, from earlier trips to Europe. So I had some sense of what they were doing, but I didn't know much about the Copenhagen School. So as I spoke with the people who were still there, Edgar Rubin, of Figure Ground fame, was the chair, but he had died before I got there. And so I had to talk to some of his colleagues. And what I realized is that they were working with another tradition of phenomenology, one that went back to Goethe, who was followed by a man named Purkinje, who was a visual psychologist. And then it was picked up by Hering, H-E-R-I-N-G, who was a researcher in a phenomenological tradition based upon Goethe's interpretation, not Husserl. So it was another way of looking at phenomenology. But when I asked the three colleagues, Ib Muskor, Franz Fromm, and Troniger Rasmussen, were the three colleagues of Rubin who were there, they really didn't know Husserl. They were aware of him, but they didn't operate within his tradition. So I explored all over Europe. I kept asking everybody I met, do you know anybody who's working with phenomenological work? And I got names, and I went to England and Germany, Belgium, France, Holland, and I met nobody who was using a phenomenological method. What I learned was phenomenological psychology meant a critique of mainstream psychology, but there was no constructive alternative. In other words, what if you already agree with phenomenology? How do you do research? How do you function? Nobody was speaking to that gap. So after surveying Europe and finding nobody, I got a little bit of courage. So when I came back to Duquesne, I started a seminar in, I think it was January 1970, called Phenomenological Psychology. I had about 8 students. I limited to 8. And I said, well, we're going to develop a method. And so we read Husserl, we began descriptively, and that's how the method started. So each year I taught the course, and of course I modified and developed. So without going through all the errors and mistakes, I'll come to the final. And I decided that, well, first of all, you have to describe. And what was important here was I started out with a talk trying to introduce phenomenology. And I was given my own description of an experience. And an empiricist said, how do I know that your description of that experience is not unconsciously in the service of your theory? Now, you can answer that, of course, but what happened is I got so bogged down with that issue, I never got to the method. So I realized that, I want to work within the reflection tradition, but I have to get my data from others. And that's what science does. Philosophers can reflect and nobody objects. Whether you got Kant or Heidegger or Husserl, they reflect and come up with things, and that's okay. But in science, somehow, I think because of the strong empirical tradition, it's got to come from others. So I thought, well, okay, it'll come from others who don't know phenomenology, so they can't bring up that objection. So the first step then is I needed naive descriptions from others. Then came the question, how do you analyze that? And that, of course, can come from interviews or description. So then what I had in front of me was Husserl's method. Husserl did have a philosophical method. But if I followed it literally, I'd be doing philosophy, not psychology. So my question was, how can I be faithful to Husserl, but make it psychological rather than philosophical? So going to others was one step already. That would be more acceptable to scientists. Then I had to do two things that Husserl does. You bracket all knowledge about the phenomenon, so I can't pull in theories or even past findings. I don't let that influence how I approach it. And then within the reduction, and the reduction means I will take as given everything that is in consciousness, but only as it's given. So again, not only are all other theories and findings bracketed, but I really approach this in a way that all my results come up from the given data, nothing is imposed on it. So that's the reduction. So I thought, yeah, I can do that to a description. Okay. Then the next question was, okay, if it's science, how do you do that? And from my training as a psychophysicist, I thought, well, it has to be systematic and methodical. So when I got the description, I thought, well, in a certain sense, I have to be the critic's best friend. So he can't get inside my consciousness, so I have to communicate as best as I can what's going through my mind in order that he knows exactly what I did. So when I got a description, I would say, well, I have to break it up somehow into parts because I can't analyze the whole description. So I thought, well, what would be the criterion? For example, I could say, well, every sentence. But a sentence is a unit of grammar, not necessarily psychologically significant. So I'm saying, well, what am I looking for? Well, I'm looking for the meaning of the experience. So I said, well, let me divide up according to meanings. So I said, I'll establish meaning units. I'll go through the whole text, and every time I experience a transition in meaning, I'll make a mark, and that becomes a meaning unit. And so at the end of that process, I have a series of meaning units, okay? Then the next step is, this description is in everyday language. I want to analyze it psychologically. So I have to give a psychological expression of an everyday event. And so I say, okay, the next step is, through the process of imaginative variation, which is a Husserlian method, you use that to come up with what is essential to the thing. So I'm looking for what is psychologically essential for the phenomenon I'm interested in, for the meaning unit I just read. And every answer is possible, from no significance to very powerful. And then you have to articulate the power that you see. So the next step is you transform all the everyday meaning units into psychological expressions, okay? And you go through all the meaning units that way. And again, I assume the critic's on my shoulder, so he sees what I'm doing. I might say, this meaning unit, there's no psychological significance. I'll go to another and I'll say, this is powerful, here's the power, and I describe it. Now he may agree or not agree with that, but then he's got to bring in counter evidence. He can't just say, I disagree. He's got to say, I disagree because when the subject said that, I believe such and such. Okay, so it should all be out in the world. It's all open, there's nothing hidden. So I go through that, and then when I have all my transform meaning units, I've got to come up with the essential structure. That is, what is the relationship among these meaning units? Can I boil it down to its essence? I don't want to carry every detail. So what I do is then, again, through a process of imaginative variation, I come up with the structure of the experience. So the structure of the experience of learning is, and I give a full description of that, which is usually briefer than all the transform meaning units. And then that becomes my result, which I publish, and it's open for critique, for disapproval, for approval, for anything that happens. So in that sense, I'm following empirical procedures. I come up with a finding, I publish it, and it's open for criticism. So that was my way of using the Husserlian method for psychological purposes, and that comes in when I come up with the psychological meaning of a everyday expression. Husserl would come up with the most invariant philosophical meaning, and that makes all the difference. Okay, so that was my modification of Husserl's philosophical method, and I claim it's essentially phenomenological and essentially scientific because it can meet all the critical functions that a scientist has to do with the results.
That's great. Okay, can you walk us through your phenomenological method step by step, as for a grad student who is interested in thinking about the method and wants to read more about it and sort of getting an overview of what it would look like?
Yeah, well, remember, I had a tension between Husserl's philosophical method and I wanted to make a scientific psychological method. And of course, I was totally trained in scientific method, so I brought that background with me. And then as I read Husserl, and I wanted to be faithful, otherwise people said that's not phenomenological. I often heard that critique, but they didn't understand phenomenology well enough. So, and then Husserl's first step was you have to get a description. And that can be naive. Anybody can give an ordinary life world description of a phenomenon. Okay, then the second step is you had to get into phenomenological reduction, which already implied a bracketing of everything you know. Husserl's point is when you're present to something and you stay immanent to it, the whole thing is given in immanence. If I see the external perception, it's always in a profile. I never get the whole object. It's always a profile. But when I have an immanent given object, I get the whole thing. There's no walking around it. The whole thing is given. So he said, if I stay within the givenness of immanence, then I'm pretty solid basis. So he says, therefore, let me bracket all external knowledge because I want everything to come up from the data that is given to me, not imposed by theories and other knowledge. Okay, so that's bracketing. Then secondly, I have to get within the reduction, which means that I will be present to the immanent givenness precisely as it shows itself, and again, bring no external information, but describe it as freshly as I experience it. Again, don't interpret it as, oh, this looks like, a sensation, or this looks like a physical thing. No, you describe it as it presents itself. And that may call for originary language, which what makes it difficult too. Most people will fall on what they know already. Okay, that's the best you can do. But the point is, can you really see freshly? That's what the reduction means. Okay, so then you come up with your own description of that. But you'd have to then, I'm dealing with the description of the other, okay? So I've got a description, but what I just described within the reduction and within the bracketing has to be done to the whole total description. So in order to make it easier for my critic, I will break it up and share as much as I can, everything I do and everything I say, so that the critic can follow me. He cannot get inside my consciousness. That's impossible. So it's my burden to make it as explicit as possible. All the steps I go through and all the intuitions, which means all the perceptions I have, everything that I see, I have to make as articulate as possible so that the critic knows what I'm responding to and what I'm doing. So then since an ordinary description, some of them go 25, 30 pages, I can't do an analysis totally, so you have to break it up. So I say, what I'm looking for is the meaning of the experience, that's phenomenological, but the psychological meaning. So let me make my discriminations of parts based on meaning discriminations. So I'll read a certain point, then read and they say, so I was in this situation and I met this friend, and then he said, I said, oh, then he said something different, so that's a meaning unit. So I make lines in the whole text until it's all based upon meaning units. So that's one step, another step. Then the next step is pretty much part of the heart of the matter. The description I get is an everyday description. Husserl calls it life world. Everyday life is always prior to all science, okay? We live in life, now science takes a special attitude toward that. So my special attitude is as a psychologist. I'm going to bring a psychological understanding of what was an everyday expression, okay? But that's what we do, right? This guy's acting crazily. Well, how is that psychologically? I think he's paranoid, so we bring our terms to it. So this becomes an intensive analysis. The subject said X. What's the psychological meaning of that? And here I use another step of Husserl's method. I have to use imaginative variation. In order for me to come up to the essential characteristic psychologically of what he said, I have to use imaginative variation. Oh, maybe he means he's scared. No, maybe he means, he's frightened. No, maybe he's just anxious. Let's see which expression really fits that everyday expression the best. So you have to do that for all the meaning units that are in there. So after that step, what you have is a series of transformed meaning units. That becomes the basis for the structure of the experience, which is the essence. So what is essentially, let's say, learning in this description? I can understand, can have different meanings for different situations, but I'm concerned about this situation. So what is essential about learning for this situation? So you come up with a situated structure. It's not universal, it's general, but not universal because the situation puts limits on it, okay? So then, again, I use imaginative variation, and I read through all the transformed meaning units, and slowly I start eliminating some as, too contingent, or some merely introductory, and then some become repetitive. Oh, he said, I was scared, another time, I was frightened. And I say, well, I can reduce those two to one meaning. And so you go through and you come up with what is essential about that situation. And that's the structure of the experience. And then, once you write that, that's what gets published. And then it's up for criticism, for grabs, for affirmation, criticism, and what are the limits around it. It's a general finding, it's not particular, but it's not universal. Uh, Philosophy gets universal. I would say science is more tied to situations than philosophy is, and situations are limiting factors. So it's a limit. So then it gets published, and criticism come, and you defend it, or you get more data, and you prove, other things. So that's the basic core of the method.
Somebody new to doing the phenomenological method in psychology, what are the points in the method where people sometimes get stuck or get lost or confused? What are the sort of roadblocks to watch out for?
Well, first of all, you have to have a background in phenomenology, at least a minimum. If there's no background, you can't do the method, simply, okay? So the hardest steps then are analyzing the description from within the reduction. That you have to be sure that you don't bring in your background and you don't bring in things you already know, so that you might read something, oh, that reminds me, of associationistic theory. Well, you can't bring that in. You've got to come up with new information strictly based on what you're reading, but from a psychological perspective. Now, that's a real big problem, because I would say the definition of psychology in the correct sense is still not an historical achievement. We have viewpoints like psychoanalytic, behavioristic, cognitive, but those can't get together and come up with one definition of psychology. And the phenomenological is a perspective too. But at least we try to say, this is our meaning of psychology, and this is what I'm trying to articulate. But I articulate it with the sense that this will be an agreeable definition of psychology for all people. Probably it won't be, so it'll be criticized, but at least that's what you shoot for, okay? So getting there too is difficult. How can I describe a psychological finding so that psychoanalysts, behaviorists, and cognitivists would not complain? I don't think you can do it in our day and age, but that's the long-range achievement, that when we get together and really come up with the genuine essence of psychology, then you can do that. But at the moment, you do the best you can. So that's one big stumbling block, that when I give workshops or gave workshops on phenomenological method, a lot of time was spent after I gave the students a description to analyze, to talk about the transformations. And I go to each student, what did you do? What did you say? And then I would see presuppositions in there, I would see viewpoints, I would see other, it wouldn't be like a pure description. So that's a real big step. Then, once you get past that, the other difficulty is the structure. How do you come from all these many manifestations of the phenomenon to boiling it down to its essence? And this takes a certain unique talent, which maybe not everybody has. Like if I asked you, oh, did you go to movies last night? What was the picture about? You'll probably give me an essential description. Oh, it was a detective story about a murderer, That would be a quick essence, right, of it. Then I ask you, how did you get that? Most people can't answer. I say, well, I saw the movie and that's what I think it was about. Well, that's what you have to do with the data. You have to come up with something that captures all the genuine variations, but leaves out the non-genuine variation, because an empirical description will have more variations than essential ones. So you have to tease out what is essential and then boil it down to quick expression. That takes a lot of time. Usually a whole session goes to coming up with the structure. I have each student give me the structure, then everybody criticizes it, talks about it, we try to make it better. So I would say those are the two talents, and note, they're all intuitive. For Husserl, intuition means perception, seeing what is there and describing it carefully. So the whole method depends upon intuition, my ability to intuit what is psychological, my ability to reduce the psychological to its pure essence, and I've got to do it all myself. And I would say that is a talent that is not even spoken to in contemporary psychology, let alone trained and developed. So that's a real big stumbling block in learning the method.